September 1893, Shudo County, Montana Territory. While every homesteader on the prairie was stuffing rags into cracks, stacking firewood against walls, reinforcing every seam. Before winter arrived, James Karimi was doing something that made three of his neighbors ride out just to confirm he had not lost his mind. The man was building a wall, not connected to his cabin, not touching his cabin, not surrounding anything, not enclosing anything. Just a freestanding arc of stacked stone, 60 feet long, curving like a crescent moon, standing alone in the middle of an open field 50 feet north of where he had driven the stakes for his future home. Robert Hargrove, who owned the largest ranch to the east and whose opinion carried more weight than any landowner or circuit judge in the county, sat on his horse at the edge of the property and stared at the thing for a long moment before he called out, "Karimi, what exactly are you building out there?" James did not look up immediately. He placed one more stone, felt its weight settle, pressed his palm flat against it to test the fit. Then he straightened. "A wind wall, sorry," he said. Hargrove looked at the arc of stone. He looked at the stakes 50 feet to the south. He looked back at the wall. "That wall is 50 feet from where your cabin is going to stand." "Yes." 50 feet of open air between a wall and a house does not protect a house. "Winter will answer that question," James said. And he bent down and picked up the next stone. Hargrove sat on his horse a while longer watching. Then he rode away, not satisfied, not convinced, just deciding for now that there was nothing more to say to a man who answered a reasonable argument with the patience of someone who already knew the outcome. That exchange was the beginning of everything. Not because either man was wrong about the other, but because they were speaking two entirely different languages, and the only translator between them was a Montana winter. James Karimi was 42 years old that spring. He had been born in 1851 in a stone village at 8,000 feet elevation in the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan, the son of a stonemason, the grandson of a stonemason, the great-grandson of a stonemason, and 4 generations before that, the same. This was not a family trapped by circumstance. It was a family shaped by necessity into something that looked from the outside like legacy. In the Hindu Kush, a stonemason did not simply build structures. A stonemason decided who lived and who did not. That was not poetry. That was the practical truth of a mountain landscape where winter winds screamed down from peaks above 16,000 feet with a force that killed not through cold alone, but through the relentless, patient pressure of moving air that found every gap, every crack, every imperfection in every wall, and pushed through it like water through a sieve. The villages of that region had learned something over centuries of loss. Fighting the wind directly was a fool's errand. Wind was not an enemy you could meet head-on. It was patient in ways that no human being could match. It had no fatigue. It had no doubt. It did not run out of resources or motivation. The only way to survive wind was to redirect it before it ever reached what you were protecting. The stonemasons of the Hindu Kush had built a solution into the landscape for 500 years, curved walls of stacked stone standing apart from the homes they protected, sometimes 20 feet away, sometimes 50, sometimes 100, the distance calculated by the wall's height, the prevailing wind angle, and the terrain. These walls did not stop the wind. They convinced it to go somewhere else. James's father had explained the principle to him on a morning when James was 7 years old, standing in front of a new cabin built by a merchant who had come from the city and had not thought to ask why the older homes all had curved stone walls standing at a distance to their north. The merchant had built well enough, thick walls, tight construction, everything sensible. Just no wind wall. The father said nothing that morning. He simply told James to watch the chimney smoke at dawn. The merchant's smoke blew horizontal, torn apart by wind the moment it left the chimney, scattered before it had risen 10 feet. The Karimi chimney smoke rose straight up, a single white thread against the gray sky, undisturbed, because the curved stone wall the grandfather had built 30 years earlier was standing 60 feet to the north, and the wind had gone somewhere else. That, James's father said, is the only reason we are standing here to watch. But the physics were not what drove James Karimi across 3 continents to a strip of Montana grassland. Physics could be read in books. What drove him was simpler and far more personal. His brother Hassan was 21 years old when he built his first cabin in a new valley. He was 2 years older than James, confident in the way that 21-year-olds are confident, skilled in the way that sons of skilled men are skilled. He knew about wind walls. He had watched them built since he could walk. He understood the principle. He was simply certain that he could wait one season, that the winter would not be severe enough to demand the wall immediately, that next year when there was more time and more stone, he would build it properly. He was wrong. The winter came hard and early. By the 14th day of the worst cold, the fire in Hassan's cabin had burned through everything he had prepared. The wall he had built was solid, the chinking, careful, the roof tight. But without the wind wall, standing guard 50 feet to the north, the wind hit his cabin at full force, and the pressure differential it created drove cold through every microscopic gap he had not even known existed. The heat left the cabin faster than the fire could produce it. By midnight, the fire had fallen to embers. By morning, it was out. James found him at first light. Hassan was seated with his back against the north wall, eyes closed, one hand still wrapped around a piece of firewood he had never had the chance to put on the fire. The hand was rigid. The wood was cold. James stood in that frozen room for a very long time. He did not speak. Their father was behind him in the doorway, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that would make it mean something different than what it meant. Later, walking back, the father said one thing only. He knew what needed to be built. He simply believed he could wait. That is not ignorance. That is a different kind of mistake entirely. James Karimi was 16 years old. He carried that morning with him for 26 years across a mountain range, across two oceans, through construction sites in New York and Chicago, through hired man work in St. Louis and Omaha, through 6 years of methodical westward movement toward a government that was giving away land to anyone willing to work it. Every stone wall he had ever built in his life, he had built with Hassan's hand in his mind. When he drove the first survey stake into the Chouteau County ground in April of 1893 and paced out the crescent shape 50 feet to the north of where his cabin would stand, he was not demonstrating a technique. He was keeping a promise to someone who no longer existed to collect it. James had left Afghanistan in 1887, 36 years old, with a modest sum of money, a pair of stonemason's hands that could read stone the way a river pilot reads water, and a knowledge of wind that no textbook in the world had written down, because the people who held it had never needed to write it down. They had simply built it into stone and passed it forward through their hands. He worked construction in New York for 2 years. Nobody asked him where he was from when he was laying a level course at 8 feet in cold weather. The work spoke clearly enough. Then Chicago for a year, then westward through the pattern of newspaper reports about the Homestead Act, a federal promise that land was available to any man willing to claim it, work it, and stay. Margaret Karimi, his wife known to everyone who met her as Maggie, followed 2 years after he was established enough to send for her. She was from the same village in the Hindu Kush. She was also the daughter of a stonemason. She had grown up watching the same grandfathers build the same curved walls for the same reasons. When her ship entered New York Harbor and she stood at the rail looking at the Manhattan skyline, the first thing she said was not about the height of the buildings or the size of the harbor. She said they built all of that and never thought about where the wind comes from. That was Maggie, direct, observant, and correct. They filed their homestead claim for a section of Chouteau County, Montana territory in the spring of 1893. The land was flat and fertile, well suited to wheat. The soil was good. Water was accessible. By every measure that American homesteaders used to evaluate a parcel, it was a solid claim. James walked it for 3 days before he touched a tool. He watched the grass bend. He watched dust move across the dry surface when the afternoon wind came through. He watched a hawk hold his position above the north end of the property, hovering without movement in air that was already pushing at 30 miles an hour. He sat down in the middle of the section and felt the wind press against his chest and counted the seconds between gusts and measured by the movement of the grass and the behavior of the dust where the lines of force were running across this particular piece of flat earth. On the evening of the second day, Maggie sat with him outside the canvas tent they had pitched as temporary shelter and asked what he was seeing. One enemy, he said, north wind, always north. It comes from Canada, hundreds of miles of nothing between here and there. No mountains to slow it, no valleys to redirect it. Just open land and then us. Simpler than home, Maggie said. Simpler to aim at, harder to ignore. He looked north into the darkening distance. The people here fight the cold. They build thicker walls, they burn more wood, They stuff rags into every gap they can find. They think the cold is the enemy. It is not. The cold is the cargo. The wind is the delivery. Stop the delivery, and the cargo never arrives. He paused. I counted the wood wagons on the southern road today. 6 wagons. It is September. By January, that will be 12 or 15. They burned through their entire winter supply fighting something they could prevent with one wall and one summer of labor. Maggie looked north with him, and yet they do not, because they have never seen what we have seen. On the morning of the 3rd day, James stood up and walked to a point 50 feet north of where his cabin stakes were marked in the ground. He dragged the toe of his boot through the dry grass in a long, slow curve, 60 feet from end to end, opening toward the south like cupped hands. Here, he said to no one in particular. Then he went to get the horses and drove to the creek 2 miles east to start hauling stone. The foundation trench came first. 6 inches deep, following the curve, he had scraped into the ground, dug below the frost line at the critical anchor points, so that when winter freeze and spring thaw cycled through the soil, the wall would not be lifted and cracked by the earth moving beneath it. It was the kind of detail that separated a wall that lasted from a wall that needed rebuilding every other year. And James had learned it from his father, the way most men learn their trade, not from instruction alone, but from watching mistakes made once and never repeated. The stone came from the creek bed. Flat stones for the foundation course selected by feel as much as by sight, each one laid and pressed and adjusted until it did not rock. Irregular stones for the body of the wall, the kind that locked against each other like puzzle pieces, the kind that a dry stack wall needed because there was no mortar to fill the gaps between them, only the geometry of stone against stone, weight against weight. His grandfather had said it plainly. Mortar hides the mistakes of a poor stonemason. Dry stack forgives nothing, but it also never cracks when the freeze comes because there is nothing to freeze. The wall either stands by its own integrity or it does not stand at all. James worked mostly alone. Maggie helped when she could spare the time from the garden and the temporary shelter and the children. Most days it was just him, the horses, the wagon, and the creek 2 miles east. He did not hurry. Hurrying with stone, it produced walls that looked complete, but were not walls that held in mild weather and failed in the conditions that actually mattered. He was building for January, not for September. By late June, the wall was rising above knee height and the curve was visible from the road. That was when Robert Hargrove came a second time, this time with a man named Crawford, who owned the largest cattle operation in the southern part of the county and whose opinion of most things was uncomplicated and delivered at volume. Hargrove sat his horse with the stillness of a man who had ridden this land for 20 years and was not easily surprised by it. Crawford shifted in his saddle and squinted at the wall with the expression of a man who had already decided what he thought, but was willing to hear something amusing. Most men would build the cabin first, Hargrove said. Shelter before anything else. That is the general order of things. James set down the stone he was carrying. The wall protects the cabin. The cabin cannot protect itself. You build the shield before you build what the shield protects. 50 feet away, Crawford said. 50 feet is the correct distance for a 4-foot wall to place the cabin at the center of the protected zone. Too close and the calm pocket is too narrow. Too far and the wind shadow has dissipated before it reaches the structure. Crawford looked at Hargrove with an expression that communicated without words that he had heard enough. But Hargrove did not move his horse. He was still watching James with the specific attention of a man who was not convinced, but was not entirely dismissing what he heard either. He had lost a daughter to a bad winter 10 years ago, a small girl, and 24 head of cattle in the same week. He had rebuilt from it. He had learned things from it about what Montana winters were capable of. He did not discuss it, but the memory sat behind his eyes every October when the temperature started its first real drop. When winter comes, Hargrove said, we will see what a wall 50 feet away is worth. Yes, James said simply, we will. Crawford rode home, convinced he had witnessed moderate lunacy. Hargrove rode home with something he would not have named as doubt about his own certainty, because he was not the kind of man who admitted doubt easily, but which was in fact exactly that. The wall was finished by late July. 60 feet of curved stone 4 feet high, 3 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2 at the top, dry stacked without a single drop of mortar opening toward the south, in an arc that James had measured and adjusted over 3 days before the first stone went in. On an August afternoon when the wind came up from the north at 15 miles an hour, James walked a test that he had done hundreds of times in his life, in mountain villages in Afghanistan, in other places, in other conditions, but never on land that was his own. He walked from north to south across the line of the wall. North of the wall, wind pressed against his chest. His coat collar lifted, his eyes wanted to narrow. The grass on the north side bent flat and continuous, every blade inclined in the same direction, a field of submission. He stepped across the wall line. The grass on the south side stood straight, not reduced, not partially calmed, straight, still unbent, as though the wind had simply decided that this particular patch of ground was not its concern. The air against his face was motionless. His coat collar fell back against his neck. The noise that the wind made against his ears on the north side was simply gone. He stood inside that stillness for a moment that had no practical purpose. The testing was already complete. The wall worked exactly as 5 generations of Karimi stonemasons had known it would work, because the physics of air flowing over a curved barrier do not change between the Hindu Kush and Shudo County, Montana. Wind does not care about geography. Wind only responds to obstacles. But James stood there anyway, because the stillness behind that wall was not just the absence of wind, it was the shape of a promise kept. It was the answer to a frozen room in Afghanistan and a hand wrapped around a piece of firewood that was never burned. He placed small stones along the ground to mark where the calm zone ended, pacing the distance. The protected area extended 90 feet behind the wall before the wind began to reassert itself. His cabin would sit at 50 feet inside the strongest part of the shelter, where the wind velocity was reduced by 60% or more. He walked back to the canvas tent where Maggie was preparing the evening meal. She looked at him once and understood without asking. "It works," she said. "It works," he said. That was all that needed saying between two people who had both grown up watching the same walls protect the same families from the same kind of cold. The cabin went up in August and September, using methods that were standard for every homesteader. In the territory, log walls, moss and clay, chinking a sod roof for insulation, a stone fireplace on the north wall. Nothing unusual, nothing expensive. The same materials and techniques that every other settler in Shudo County was using. The only difference was position. The cabin stood 50 feet south of the Crescent wall inside the calm zone that James had mapped with small stones on the day he tested his work. By late September, both structures stood complete. The wall looked to anyone passing on the road like the remnant of something ancient and inexplicable, a fragment of a larger structure that had lost its purpose, a religious monument perhaps, or the border marker of a civilization that no longer existed to explain it. It stood alone in its field with no obvious relationship to the cabin 50 feet away, and it generated with quiet efficiency exactly the kind of conversation that James had predicted it would generate. William Aldridge, the land agent who had processed the homestead claim, rode out in late September with a piece of paper and an uncomfortable expression. "Karimi," he said, "I've received complaints from town. People are saying you've built a religious structure on homestead land. The Homestead Act does not permit that use." James set down his work and looked at Aldridge directly. "Walk with me." He led the land agent along the foundation of the wall, pointing as he went. No roof, no door, no altar, no symbol, no marking of any kind. Stone stacked on stone, 4 feet high, 60 feet long, curving toward the south. "This is a windbreak," James said. "My people have built them for 500 years. They protect homes from mountain gales. This one will protect my home from prairie gales." Aldridge looked at the wall, then at the cabin, then at the 50 feet of open ground between them. "A wall 50 feet from your cabin. Wind does not stop at a wall. Wind goes over a wall and continues traveling upward rather than forward. The air immediately behind the wall is undisturbed for 100 feet or more. My cabin sits inside that calm zone." Aldridge was quiet for a moment, writing in his notebook with a pencil he held too tightly. "If this is not what you say it is," he said finally, "there will be formal challenges. Challenges that could affect the status of this claim." James met his eyes and did not look away. "Recorded as an agricultural windbreak structure. That is what it is." Aldridge wrote it down, closed the notebook, looked at the wall one more time, as though waiting for it to reveal something it had been concealing. Then he mounted his horse and rode back toward town. Maggie watched from the cabin doorway. "They think it is a temple," she said when James came back. "Let them think it," he said. "The first hard freeze will think for them." The temperature that night dropped to 22 degrees. A preview, a taste of what was building to the north. James went outside after dark and stood behind the wall in the stillness it created, looking up at stars that were very sharp and very cold, and thought about what was coming. He had built the shield. Now all that remained was to survive long enough for the shield to prove itself. October arrived in Shudo County the way a creditor arrives without announcement and without patience. The first hard frost came on the 8 thin white coatings across the grass that burned off by mid-morning, but left a residue of understanding in the air, a reminder that the pleasant months had been borrowed time and that the account was now being called in. The cottonwood trees along the creek bottoms went yellow in a single week, as though the cold had reached into them and pulled the color out by the roots. The sky took on the particular quality of light that old-timers recognized, and younger settlers were still learning to read a high, thin brightness that gave warmth without giving warmth, that illuminated the landscape with perfect clarity while doing nothing at all for the temperature. James watched the season change the way he watched everything, which was with the full attention of a man who had learned that the world communicated in signals most people were too busy to read. He watched the grass and the way the morning wind moved across it. He watched the smoke from distant chimneys, all of them blowing horizontal by 9 in the morning, torn apart before they had risen 20 feet. He stood at the north side of his finished wall on a morning when the thermometer read 14 degrees and felt the gale hit him like something with intention, something that had been traveling south for 300 miles without meeting a single obstacle worth the name. And then he stepped around to the south side and stood in the stillness that the wall created. Still, not quieter, still. He did not stay long. There was work to do before the ground hardened completely, and a man did not pause in October in Montana unless he wanted to discover in January what he had failed to complete in the fall. He went back to work. But he noted the difference with the part of his mind that kept records. Thomas Craig came to see him on the 9th of October, riding over from the northeast section with the easy confidence of a man who had survived enough winters in Iowa that he had stopped believing any winter could truly surprise him. He was 32 years old, unmarried, and had built a cabin that by any external measure was solid work. He had been polite to James on the few occasions they had spoken the way men are polite to neighbors they intend to mostly ignore. He looked at the Crescent wall with detached curiosity. "Heard you built some kind of windbreak," he said. "We used living trees in Iowa, rows of them north of the property. Took a few years to grow in, but they did the job well enough." "Trees take years," James said. "I needed protection this winter." "Your wall has no gaps," Cray observed. "Trees have space between the trunks. Wind finds its way through." "Yes," Cray nodded with the appreciation of a man filing a minor technical point. He looked at the 50 feet of open ground between the wall and the cabin. "Long way between your wall and your house. 50 feet is the correct distance for a 4-foot barrier. Close enough that the calm zone reaches the cabin. Far enough that the cabin sits in the center of the protected area rather than at the edge of it." Cray was quiet for a moment. Then he said with genuine pleasantness, "How much firewood have you put up?" "4 cords." "I have 2. He said it without concern. "Got me through Iowa winters with a cord to spare. Montana can't be that much different." James looked at Thomas Cray. He looked at the easy set of the man's shoulders, the unconcerned way he sat his horse, the quality of confidence that came from having survived things before, and concluded that survival was simply a matter of preparation and toughness, both of which he possessed. He thought about Hassan, about how Hassan had said something very similar, though in a different language in a different world 26 years ago. "Would you like to learn how to build a wind wall?" James asked. "I can show you before the ground freezes hard." "I appreciate it," Cray said, "but I think I am set." He rode back across the brown October grass with the loose, unhurried motion of a man who had nothing pressing on his mind. James watched him go for a long moment. Then he turned back to his work, and the thought that settled in him was not judgment and not contempt. It was a kind of sorrow he had no right to act on, because a man who had been warned and declined to hear the warning had made a choice, and there was nothing more to be done about it until the consequences made themselves known. November brought the first serious cold, temperature down to 14 degrees on the night of the eighth, wind steady from the north at 30 miles an hour, the kind of night that was not the worst of what Montana could do, but was sufficient to establish the terms of the negotiation. The next morning, Eric Strand rode past on the southern road. Strand was a Swedish farmer who had been in Shudo County for 12 years, old enough in the territory to have earned a different relationship with winter than the newer settlers. He was 61, deliberate in his movements, and he had been watching James build the Crescent Wall since May, with the patient interest of a man who understood windbreaks in principle even if he had never seen one built from stone. He stopped his horse on the road and looked north across the property. From where he sat, he could see two chimneys. James Karimi's cabin chimney 50 feet south of the Crescent Wall, inside the calm zone that the wall had been generating since July. And Robert Hargrove's ranch house chimney, a quarter-mile east, standing exposed on open ground, the way every other structure in the county stood facing the wind without mediation. Hargrove's smoke was horizontal. The wind caught it the moment it left the chimney and laid it flat, tearing it apart in a continuous horizontal stream that vanished within 30 feet. Karimi's smoke went straight up, a single pale thread rising in perfect vertical stillness, undisturbed, as though the wind that was currently laying every other chimney smoke flat in the county had simply forgotten this one existed. Strand sat on his horse and looked at those two chimneys for a full minute. Then he took a small notebook from his coat pocket and wrote in it with a pencil. He wrote the date and the wind speed as best he could estimate it in a single line of observation. He put the notebook back and wrote on. He had been a farmer long enough to know that the most important things were usually the simplest things, and the simplest thing he had just seen was this one family's chimney smoke was behaving differently from every other family's chimney smoke in the county. And the only variable between them was a curved stone wall standing 50 feet to the north of one house and nothing at all standing 50 feet to the north of the other. By mid-November, the community of Shudo County had organized itself without anyone planning it into the configurations that communities always adopt when something they don't understand is happening in their midst. There were those who had decided the wall was peculiar and foreign and probably religious in nature, and who communicated this view with the confidence of people who felt that their unfamiliarity with something was itself a form of evidence against it. There were those who had no opinion and wanted none, being too occupied with their own preparations to invest thought in a neighbor's eccentricity, and there were those few who were watching carefully and reserving judgment. Robert Hargrove occupied a complicated position in this arrangement. He was not a man given to gossip or to the kind of group opinion-making that happened at the general store and the saloon in Fort Benton. His instinct was always toward the concrete and the demonstrated. He had seen the wall. He had felt the stillness behind it on that September afternoon when James had led him and Crawford through the Crescent's arc and the wind had stopped as though a door had been closed. He had not forgotten that, but he had also not integrated it into any view he was willing to act on, because acting on something unproven was not how Robert Hargrove had built the most successful ranch in the eastern section of the county. His wife Clara was 43 years old and had a different relationship with unproven things. She was the one who had lost a daughter in the winter of 1883, a small girl of 4 years who had developed fever in a cold snap, and whose fever had been made worse, the doctor said afterward, by the constant chill of a cabin that could not hold warmth against the wind pressure that drove cold air through the chinking and under the doors in a continuous invisible current. Clara had never stopped connecting that winter to the specific quality of the wind that had blown through those weeks. She remembered the sound of it. She remembered how the fire had burned and the room had stayed cold anyway. In September, before the wall was quite finished, she had driven the wagon past the Karimi property on an errand to the south end of the county. She had stopped on the road and looked at the crescent of stone. She had gotten down from the wagon and walked to the south side of the wall and stood in the stillness. It was already generating even before completion, and stayed there for perhaps 3 minutes while the wind ran across the field on the other side of the stone and went somewhere that was not where she was standing. She did not tell Robert. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the things she understood but could not yet explain. Reverend Thomas Webb came to see James on a gray afternoon in late November, riding alone, which was different from the way Hargrove had come with Crawford in June, and which communicated something about the nature of the visit before a word was spoken. Webb was the minister of the only congregation that most of Shudo County attended with any regularity a man of 60 who had been in the territory long enough to have genuine authority, not the authority of title, but the authority of having been trusted by people through hard times and been found worthy of that trust. He dismounted and stood with James in the yard and spoke without evasion. "I need to ask you something directly," he said. "People in town are saying you face this wall every morning, that you bow toward it." James looked at him. "I check it every morning. I bend down to the foundation course for frost heave. I stand facing it to measure the shadow it casts because the length and angle of the shadow tells me the precise direction of the prevailing wind more accurately than a compass. That is inspection and measurement." "I am not accusing you," Webb said. "I am telling you what people see and what they conclude from what they see. People see what they expect to see." "Yes," Webb said, "and that is the problem I am here to discuss." He paused. He looked at the wall. He looked at the cabin. He was quiet for a moment in the way that men who are about to say something important are quiet while they organize it properly. "If that wall works," Webb said, "and I am beginning to believe it may, then your family will be warm when your neighbors are cold. You will use a fraction of the firewood they burn. You will be comfortable in conditions that make them desperate. And you are already a man who is not from here, whose customs are not understood, whose building is not understood. You understand what I am saying?" James said nothing. "I'm not telling you to hide your advantage," Webb continued. "I am telling you that the gap between your circumstances and theirs, when it becomes visible, which it will in a hard winter, will not be received with admiration. It will be received with resentment." "Then the answer is to teach them," James said. Webb looked at him with something that was both respect and concern. "Will they accept instruction from you?" It was the only question Webb asked that James did not have a ready answer for, because it was the right question and he did not yet know the answer. Webb rode home. The light was already failing. James stood in the yard and looked north at the wall, standing in the diminishing afternoon, 4 feet of curved stone against an open sky, and thought about the question Webb had left behind. He had not built the wall to change anyone's mind. He had built it to keep a promise. Whether the promise could be extended to the people around him was a different matter and not one he could settle by himself. December arrived with a preliminary statement of intent, a 4-day cold snap that took the temperature to 20 below zero and held it there while a north wind ran at 25 miles an hour. This was not the worst of what was coming, but it was enough. Thomas Craig came to James's door on the morning of December 8th. He had ridden 3 miles in cold that froze the moisture at his nostrils and left ice crystals on the front of his coat. His face was raw. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been awake most of the night doing mathematics he did not like the results of. "I made an error in my accounting," Cray said, standing at the door, not asking to come in because he was still a man with enough pride to stand outside while he said the next part. "I have 1 cord of wood remaining. At the rate I have been burning through it, it will last perhaps 3 weeks. James stepped back from the door. "Come in." Cray came in. The interior of the cabin was 52 degrees. He felt it the moment he crossed the threshold. Not the aggressive heat of a fire being flogged at full capacity to push back against a losing battle, but the settled, even warmth of a room that was not fighting anything. 2 of the children were playing on the floor in ordinary clothes. Maggie was at the table without a heavy coat. The thermometer on the wall read 52 degrees Fahrenheit when the temperature outside was 21 below zero. Cray looked at the thermometer for a long moment. Then he looked at James. "There is room here," James said. "Stay the winter. In spring you help me with the wheat planting, and I teach you to build the wall." Cray was 32 years old and had lived alone for 6 years and had come from Iowa with the certainty that a competent man could handle whatever came at him if he prepared properly. He stood in a warm cabin in December in Chute County, Montana, and looked at a thermometer that said 52 degrees and thought about the cord of wood he had left in the weeks that still remained until spring. "I accept," he said. No other words were necessary. The 2 men understood each other without them. January 7th, 1894. The system came down from Canada without much advance notice beyond what the sky had been saying for 2 days to anyone who knew how to read it, a deepening high thin cloud, a particular stillness in the morning air that was not calm, but compression, the atmosphere pressing down before the cold front behind it arrived to take over. James had read those signs on the 6th and split additional wood and stacked it inside the cabin door. He said nothing about it to Cray or to Maggie because there was nothing to be gained by naming it before it arrived. The temperature fell from 8 below zero at 6 in the evening to 36 below at midnight. By dawn on the 8th, it was 41 below, and the north wind was running at 35 miles an hour without a pause between gusts. By the morning of the 12th, the thermometer outside the land office in Fort Benton read 47 degrees below zero. What happened to the unprotected homesteads in Shudo County during those days was not a matter of bad luck or inadequate preparation. It was a matter of physics. A cabin standing exposed on open prairie and wind of 35 miles an hour is not a shelter in any meaningful sense. It is a structure through which wind moves, creating positive pressure on the windward side that drives cold air through every imperfection in the construction and simultaneously creating negative pressure on the leeward side that pulls warm air out through those same gaps like a bellows working in reverse. The cabin becomes a machine for the exchange of cold air for warm air, and the fire inside it becomes a machine that produces warmth at the maximum rate it can sustain, while the wind removes that warmth at a rate that scales with the square of the wind speed. At 35 miles an hour, heat loss to infiltration is 16 times what it is at a calm 5 miles an hour. Not 2 times, not 4 times, 16. Robert Hargrove ran 2 cast iron stoves around the clock, he and his eldest son feeding them in shifts through the nights, waking in the frozen dark every hour to keep the fire from dropping below the threshold where the cabin would begin its rapid thermal collapse. The main room held 16 degrees when both stoves were at full burn. It dropped to 2 degrees within the hour when they had to stop feeding long enough to go to the woodpile. Clara Hargrove sat next to the stove on the night of the 12th, the coldest night, and counted what remained in the woodpile. She did the division. She looked at the calendar. She looked at the thermometer. Then she looked north from the frost-covered window toward where she knew, though she could not see through the dark and the driven snow, the Karimi property lay. She thought about the afternoon in September when she had stopped the wagon and walked to the south side of the Crescent wall and stood in the air that was motionless while the world on the other side of the stone was moving at 15 miles an hour. She thought about the chimney smoke she had watched from the road in November, Hargrove's smoke horizontal, Karimi's smoke straight up. She dressed in every layer she owned. She did not wake Robert, who had finally fallen into exhausted sleep in the chair by the stove. She went outside into the killing dark. The wind hit her the moment she stepped off the porch, a force that was not weather in any ordinary sense, but something more absolute, a physical presence that had no patience for human plans or human warmth. She walked north and slightly west, keeping her face turned down and her back angled to the worst of the gust, moving through snow that was blowing horizontal so thick she could barely see the ground at her feet. Half a mile. She counted her steps without deciding to count them. The cold was of the kind that goes beyond sensation into something that simply registers as wrong, as a violation of the conditions under which living things are supposed to operate. She felt the wall before she saw it, felt the air pressure change against her face as the crescent of stone deflected the flow upward, and away felt the gust that had been pressing her back for 30 minutes simply stop. She stepped into the stillness. Snow was falling on the south side of the wall in a straight, vertical line, slow and quiet, each flake descending without interference. It was the same storm, the same temperature, the same night. She had moved 10 feet through a curve of stone and entered a different world. She stood in the dark, and the snow fell straight down around her, and she was still cold, but she was not being pushed backward anymore, and the roaring that had been in her ears since she left the house was gone. She cried, not from the cold, from the grief of understanding too late and in the worst possible conditions what had been available to every family in Shudo County since July, if only anyone had been willing to understand it. Maggie opened the cabin door before Clara knocked. She had heard the footsteps in the stillness, that the wall created sounds that carried clearly in the calm zone while the storm raged just 50 feet away. She stepped aside without speaking. Clara Hargrove walked into warmth. The morning of January 12th was the coldest morning in the recorded history of Shudo County, and James Karimi woke to a cabin that was 49 degrees Fahrenheit. He checked the thermometer twice, not because he doubted the reading, but because the number deserved confirmation. The fire had burned down to coals 3 hours earlier. There had been no one stoking it through the small hours of the morning, no one hauling wood in the dark, no one running the sustained, desperate campaign that every other household within 5 miles of this spot was running just to keep the temperature from dropping to the point where water froze indoors. 49 degrees. Fire out since 3 in the morning. 47 below zero outside. He dressed without hurrying and went to the door and opened it and stepped out into the calm zone behind the wall. The north side of the wall was invisible. The storm had reduced visibility to less than 20 feet on the open prairie snow, driving horizontal like something with grievance, the wind running at 35 miles an hour with gusts that occasionally exceeded that by enough to lean into. He could hear it, a sustained low roar that was not dramatic in the way that storms and stories are dramatic, but was instead simply relentless, the sound of a force that had no intention of stopping and no awareness of the damage it was doing. He stepped to the south side of the wall, and the roar dropped to a murmur. Snow fell straight down in the calm zone, the individual flakes visible and unhurried in a way that seemed impossible given what was happening 50 feet away. His coat stopped pressing against his body. The cold was still absolute, the same 47 below zero that it was on the other side of the stone. But the wind-driven component of that cold, the factor that multiplied the danger by 16, was simply absent. He stood there for a moment. Just a moment. Not to confirm what he already knew, but because some things deserved to be stood in quietly without moving on too quickly. The chimney smoke from his cabin rose straight up. He could see through the driven white of the storm the vague, dark shapes of other properties to the east, and from one of them, the Hargrove place, a chimney was visible, not by its structure, but by the behavior of its smoke, which emerged and immediately went horizontal and vanished, torn into nothing, before it had risen 10 feet above the roofline. Two chimneys, two columns of smoke, one going straight up, one gunning on in the moment it appeared. The difference between them was not the quality of the wood burning inside, not the construction of the fireplaces, not the diligence of the families tending the fires. The difference was 60 feet of curved stone standing 50 feet to the north of one house and nothing standing 50 feet to the north of the other. He went back inside and put wood on the coals and made coffee and began the day. Clara Hargrove had been in the cabin since before 4 in the morning, sitting at the table with Maggie, in the particular companionship of two women who do not share a language fully, but share an understanding that runs underneath language and does not require it. The children had woken briefly and gone back to sleep. Thomas Cray had woken, registered the presence of a neighbor woman, registered the temperature and the sound of the storm, and gone back to his corner of the cabin with the discretion of a man who understood that whatever was happening at that table was not his business. By the time James came in from checking the wall, the coffee was made, and the morning light was coming through the frost-covered window, and Clara was warming her hands around a tin cup and looking at the thermometer on the wall. 49 degrees, she said. Yes. Robert's cabin has not been above 20 degrees in 4 days. We are burning through a cord every 3 days. He has 2 cords remaining. James sat down at the table across from her. He did not say anything immediately. There was nothing useful in saying anything immediately. He needs to know, Clara said. Not from me. He would hear it from me as a wife, talking about what another man is doing differently, and he would manage to turn that into something that did not require him to change his thinking. He needs to hear it from you. Hargrove does not want to hear it from me, James said. He did not want to hear it in September, Clara said. It is January now, and his wood supply is failing in the worst cold in the county's history. She set down the cup. He is a man who respects evidence. Give him evidence he cannot argue with. James looked at her. She had walked half a mile in 47 below zero in the middle of the night rather than wake her husband to tell him she was going for help because she understood her husband well enough to know that the help had to come to him, not the other way around. That was not weakness on her part. That was a very precise reading of how a particular kind of man could be reached. He will come, Maggie said quietly from the other side of the room, not looking up from what she was doing. When the wood runs low enough, he will come. She said it with the certainty of someone who was not predicting, but simply stating what she already knew. Daniel Pruitt was 61 years old, a veteran of the Wilderness Campaign in 1864, a man who had homesteaded alone in the northeastern section of Chouteau County for 7 years without asking much from anyone and without having much asked of him. He had survived battles that killed the men standing next to him. He had survived 3 previous Montana winters. He had put up what he calculated was sufficient firewood for the season based on what the previous winters had required. The previous winters had not been 1894. Robert Hargrove found him on the morning of January 14th, when the worst of the cold had relented enough to make riding possible. He was doing what he always did after a hard stretch, checking the properties of neighbors who lived alone, the kind of quiet obligation that nobody in the community had established formally, but which Hargrove had taken on years ago and continued without making a point of it. Pruitt was seated on the floor with his back against the north wall of his cabin, still in his coat, one hand resting open in his lap. The fire was long out. The wood was gone. The thermometer inside the cabin read the same as the thermometer outside. Hargrove stood in the doorway for a long time without going in. The wind had dropped to 15 miles an hour, and the sky was the high pitiless blue that follows a killing cold snap, beautiful in the way that things are sometimes beautiful, precisely because of what they accompany. He stood there and looked at Daniel Pruitt and thought about what it had cost the man to get to that particular morning. The firewood carried in all fall, the preparations made, the reasonable calculations that had turned out to be wrong, because no one in Shudo County had told him or anyone else that the calculation was not just about how much wood you had, but about how fast the wind was taking the heat through walls that had no shield in front of them. He rode home in a state that was not grief exactly, though it had grief in it. It was more specific than grief. It was the feeling of a man who is understanding with the clarity that only comes when the evidence is final and unambiguous that he has been wrong about something in a way that had consequences he did not choose and cannot now undo. He sat at his kitchen table and did not speak for an hour. Clara sat nearby and did not speak either. She had come home from the creamy cabin before dawn, before he had woken, and she had said nothing about where she had been. She would tell him, but not yet. When Hargrove finally looked up, he said, "Pruitt is dead." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know?" She told him. Not everything and not in order, but enough. The cord of wood, the dark, the walk, the wall, and what happened when she stepped behind it. The door opening before she knocked. By the time she finished, the coffee in his cup had gone cold and he had not moved to warm it. Robert Hargrove listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet again. The quality of his silence had changed. It was not the silence of a man who was forming a counter-argument. It was the silence of a man who was accepting something. "I will go tomorrow," he said. He came on January 15th, 2 days after finding Pruitt. The ride took nearly 2 hours through snow that had settled, but not packed, and the cold was still 22 below. Not the worst anymore, but sufficient. He saw the smoke first. His own chimney smoke, when he left the house, had blown flat the moment it left the pipe, same as it had blown for every hard day of the past 8. He had stopped noticing it because it was simply the condition of the world. But when he came within sight of the Karimi property, the smoke rising from that chimney was so vertical, so undisturbed, so completely indifferent to the wind that was pushing against his face and his horse's chest at that very moment that he pulled up without deciding to and sat still for a moment just looking at it. A straight line going up, in a world where every line went horizontal. He rode to the Crescent wall and stopped. He sat his horse and looked at the arc of stone and then dismounted and walked around to the south side of it. The wind stopped, not diminished, not partially blocked, stopped. He was still in the same storm, the same 22 below the same day. But the moving component of the cold, the element that had been pressing against him for 2 hours, was simply absent. He walked to the cabin door and knocked. Maggie answered and stepped aside. He went in. The cabin was 52 degrees. He felt it move through his coat before he had fully crossed the threshold. Not the aggressive heat of desperate burning, but the settled warmth of a room that was simply not cold. One of the children was sitting on the floor, doing something with a piece of string. Thomas Cray was in the corner with a book. Maggie went back to the stove without ceremony. James was at the table. He looked up when Hargrove came in and did not look surprised because he was not surprised. Hargrove stood just inside the door and looked at the thermometer on the wall. 52 degrees. "How much wood are you burning?" he said. 4 times a day, 5 logs each time." Hargrove did the mathematics without speaking. Less than half a cord every 2 weeks. He had burned through a cord every 3 days in the worst of it. His entire winter supply, which he had believed was sufficient when he stacked it in October, was going to run out before the end of February. "Daniel Pruitt died," Hargrove said. "I know. He had no protection from the wind. No. Same walls as everyone else in the county. Yes. Hargrove put his hand flat on the cabin wall, log wall moss and clay chinking. Nothing different from his own construction, nothing different from Pruitt's construction, nothing different from the construction of every homestead in Shudo County. The same wall that had been failing to hold warmth for every other family in the county during the worst cold in the county's history was holding warmth just fine in this cabin, and the only thing that was different was outside standing 50 feet to the north in a curve of stacked stone. I called it a prayer wall, Hargrove said. James said nothing. I came out here in June, and I told you that a wall 50 feet from your house could not protect your house. I told you winter would teach you. He stopped. Winter taught me instead. There was a long silence. The fire in the stove made a small sound. Outside, the wind ran across the top of the crescent wall and went somewhere that was not this room. Teach me to build it, Hargrove said. Please. James looked at him across the table. Not with satisfaction, not with anything that could be mistaken for the pleasure of having been proved right. Simply with the straight regard of one man to another who had just said something it had cost him something to say. Spring, James said, when the ground thaws, come in April and we will build yours. Hargrove nodded. That was all that was needed. Not an apology received, not a grievance acknowledged, not any of the ritual of reconciliation that gets built up around moments like this one. Two men had reached an agreement about what would happen next, and the agreement was sufficient. Surveyor Mitchell came in the first week of February with measuring instruments and a leather notebook and spent 3 days documenting what the crescent wall was actually doing to the wind. He was a methodical man with a practical understanding of the value of numbers in converting what people felt with their bodies into something they could not argue with. North side of the wall, 34 miles per hour. South side at the wall itself, 12 miles per hour. At 50 feet south, 8 miles per hour. At the cabin door, nearly nothing. He wrote in his notebook in the careful hand of someone who knew that what he was writing would be read by people who needed to be convinced. Wind velocity reduced by 76% at the cabin location, because heat loss through infiltration scales with the square of wind speed. A 76% reduction in velocity produces a 94% reduction in wind-driven heat loss. This cabin, by this measurement, loses approximately 1/16 the heat through infiltration that an equivalent unprotected cabin loses under identical conditions. He showed the numbers to James, who read them and nodded. Your grandfather's estimate was 60% reduction, Mitchell said. He was being conservative, James said. He said the number was always better than 60, but never worse. He wanted to build walls that were certain to work, not walls that only worked if everything went exactly right. Mitchell brought his numbers to a community meeting in Fort Benton in the third week of February. 30 people came, which was most of the adult population of the county, within riding distance. The meeting had been called by Aldridge, the land agent, who had spent the winter watching his early notation of James's windbreak as an agricultural structure turned from a bureaucratic technicality into something that felt more like a failure to act on available information. James sat in the back of the room. He had been invited to attend, but not to speak, which suited him. The numbers would speak. Mitchell presented his measurements. Aldridge read through the winter's accounting, one death, extensive livestock losses, multiple families who had burned through their winter wood supply before February and were now dependent on emergency purchases from Fort Benton at prices that reflected scarcity. Then Robert Hargrove stood up. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when a man who does not often speak publicly stands to speak. I came to James Karimi in June, he said, and told him his wall 50 feet from his house was useless. I told him winter would teach him. I was wrong about which of us needed the lesson. He stopped for a moment. My wife walked half a mile alone in 47 below zero on the worst night of the worst winter this county has seen, because the warmest place within her reach was a cabin behind a wall that I had called a prayer wall. Daniel Pruitt died in a frozen cabin 4 miles from my house because nobody in this county, myself included, had told him what James Karimi came here knowing. He looked around the room. I am building a wind wall before next October. Anyone who wants to come see how it is done is welcome on my property. He sat down. James in the back row looked at the floor and said nothing. This was not his victory to celebrate. It had been purchased at a price he would not have chosen, and no celebration was appropriate. In March, when the worst had passed and the snow was beginning its slow retreat from the south-facing slopes, Maggie Karimi began doing what she had been doing quietly all winter and would continue doing in the years ahead, which was teaching. Not the same teaching that James did. James taught the physical construction, the selection of stone, the geometry of the curve, the mathematics of distance and height and protected zone. He taught it to men who came in ones and twos in the spring with questions and left with measurements and an understanding of what they needed to build and why. Maggie taught the other thing, which was harder to quantify and more fundamental. Clara Hargrove came on a morning in late March when the ice on the creek was just beginning to loosen and the grass was showing the first thin green at its roots, and they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and talked for 2 hours. Clara had come with questions she had been carrying since the night she walked through the storm and felt the wind stop at the wall. "How did you know where to look?" Clara asked. "How did you know before you arrived that this land would need what James built?" Maggie thought about this for a moment. "We did not know this land specifically. We knew the principle. The principle is always the same. Wind is the enemy, not cold. Find the wind, redirect the wind before it reaches what you are protecting. The specific calculation is different in every place, every terrain, every prevailing direction. But the principle does not change. Why does no one here know this? Because you learned what kills you from what almost killed you. In Afghanistan, we grew up knowing that wind kills. Here you grew up knowing that cold kills. Both are true, but they lead to different solutions." Clara was quiet for a while. Outside the window, the first clear day in weeks was making the snow blindingly white. "The night I came," Clara said, "I was going to wake Robert. Then I decided not to. Was that right?" Maggie looked at her with the steady regard of a woman who had been watching people carefully for 20 years across multiple cultures and had formed clear views about what she saw. "You knew your husband," Maggie said simply. "You knew how he could be reached. You were right." This was the thing that Maggie understood that no measurement could capture, which was that knowledge was only useful if it could move from one person to another, and that the path between people was not always straight and was never the same twice. The knowledge of wind and walls that James carried from the Hindu Kush was old and true and demonstrably correct. But it would only spread through Shudo County along the paths that human beings actually used to trust each other, which were irregular and personal, and could not be designed in advance, only navigated with attention. Maggie navigated those paths, quietly, consistently, over many years. In April, when the ground had thawed enough to dig, Robert Hargrove came to the Karimi property with his eldest son and spent 3 days learning to build a wind wall from the man whose wall he had once dismissed. He came without ceremony. He worked without complaint. He asked good questions, the kind that came from someone who was actually trying to understand the principle rather than just copy the form, and James answered them with the patience of a man who had spent his life explaining things to people who were seeing them for the first time. Thomas Cray built his own wall in April, working mostly alone, the measurements memorized from months of observation and conversation. It was not as precise as James's, the curve slightly irregular, the distance from his cabin slightly short of optimal. But it stood, and it was stone, and it would do what it was supposed to do when the next winter arrived. When James came to look at it, Cray was standing on the south side of the finished wall in a light April wind, feeling the difference. "You can feel it working before it has worked," Cray said. "Before any winter has tested it. You can just feel that the air is different back here." "Yes," James said. Cray looked down at his hands, at the 2 fingers on his right hand that had been damaged in the night he had been caught in his own unheated cabin in December, the nerve endings that had never fully recovered the cold sensitivity that would be with him for the rest of his life. "I should have listened in October," he said. "You came in December," James said. "Some men would not have come at all." Reverend Webb came to see James on an October afternoon a year after the Crescent wall had first gone up, on a day when the light had the specific quality of late-season light in Montana clear, and a little sad, the kind of light that knows what is coming. They sat inside, and Webb asked the question he had been carrying since the previous winter. "If you had known in May of last year that people would call your wall a temple, that your intentions would be questioned, that the land agent would come to threaten your claim, that your neighbors would watch you with suspicion through an entire winter, Would you have built it anyway? James considered this not because he did not know the answer, but because the question deserved the respect of actual consideration before it was answered. Yes, he said. Why, guy? Because I had made a promise to someone who could no longer hold me to it. And a promise that only holds because someone is watching it is not a promise, it is a performance. Webb sat with this for a while. The wall has changed things in this county, he said finally. Not just the warmth, the way people think about winter, about what can be done in advance of a problem rather than in response to it. That is a change that will outlast the wall itself. James said nothing for a moment. He looked out the window at the crescent wall standing in the October field, the same 60 feet of curved stone he had finished in July of the previous year, already weathering slightly at the capstones, the stone taking on the gray-brown patina of a structure that had found its place in the landscape and settled into permanence. I did not build it to change anything, he said. I built it to keep one person warm. And you have kept a great many people warm. That was the winter's work, James said, not mine. By 1902, 14 properties in Chute County had incorporated some form of wind protection. Not all of them were stone. Crawford, who had laughed at Hargrove's account of the Caramy cabin in the darkest days of the January freeze, planted 2 rows of cottonwood in a crescent pattern 50 feet north of his house that spring. He would wait 7 years for them to reach useful height, and those 7 years cost him in firewood, and in cold winters he could have spent differently. But the trees grew, and when they reached their full height, they were stronger than stone in certain ways, deep-rooted and flexible, giving before the wind rather than opposing it, and they stood long after Crawford himself was gone. Strand built a wooden wall as a temporary measure, while his tree rows matured, understanding that the principle was more important than the material, and that something imperfect and immediate was more useful than something perfect and delayed. Hargrove built his double wall system in the spring of 1894, 2 curved barriers at different distances from the house and barn, creating overlapping calm zones that reduced wind velocity to nearly nothing at the structures themselves. His cattle losses in the winters that followed dropped to a fraction of what they had been before. Not because the winters were milder, but because his animals had shelter that the mathematics of wind actually supported. These things spread the way all genuinely useful knowledge spreads in communities that work with their hands, not through formal instruction or published accounts, but through the specific mechanism of one man seeing another man's results and asking how he got them, and the answer being given without reservation. James Caramy lived on that section of Chute County land for 28 years until his death in the autumn of 1921 at the age of 70. He farmed it and improved it and taught anyone who came asking how to build the thing that had made it survivable. And he did all of this without making a particular story of himself, because the story was not the point. The Crescent Wall stood until 1967, when his grandson William, a practical Montana farmer of 53, who operated with tractors and modern equipment that needed room to maneuver, took it apart stone by stone to clear the path. He worked methodically through the structure, placing the stones to the side, and when he reached the foundation course, the flat, wide stones that James had selected by hand from the creek bed 74 years earlier, he stopped. He sat down on the ground next to the foundation stones and stayed there for a while without any particular purpose. These were stones that his grandfather had carried. This was the specific material reality of a promise kept by a man he had never met, who had crossed 3 continents to make it, who had built it before he built the house. It protected because the shield came first and the house came after. William Caramy was not a sentimental man. He was a farmer in 1967 with a television and a truck and no particular tendency toward dwelling on the past. But he called his son over. "We keep some of these," he said. "Pick the ones that look like they belong together." His son asked why. William looked at the stones. He thought about what he knew of his grandfather, which was not detailed, but was sufficient, a man from Afghanistan who had come to Montana and built a wall that the county had called a prayer wall, and that had kept his family warm when other families were burning through their wood supply and still freezing. Because someone carried them a long way, he said, for a good reason. 3 of the foundation stones from the original Crescent Wall now sit in a small garden behind the Chute County Historical Society. They are not labeled with anything dramatic. A small sign says that they are from a windbreak constructed in 1893 by an Afghan stonemason on a homestead in the eastern section of the county, and that the windbreak was notable for its curved design and for the distance it stood from the structure it protected. The sign does not say that a man built it for his dead brother. It does not say that it stood through the worst winter in the county's recorded history and kept a family warm when the fire went out at 3 in the morning. It does not say that a woman walked half a mile alone through 47 below zero to reach it, or that the man who had called it a prayer wall came to learn how to build one, or that the knowledge it carried had crossed from a mountain range in Afghanistan to a flat stretch of Montana grassland in the hands of one man who understood what wind could do and what stone could do about it. The stones remember in the way that stones remember, which is to say they do not remember at all. They simply continue to exist unchanged, carrying nothing and holding nothing, exactly as heavy as they were when James Karimi pulled them from a creek bed in the spring of 1893. The wind still blows across Shudo County. It has no memory either. It does not know that it was once redirected. It does not know about the man who knew where to stand a wall, or the brother whose frozen hand made the knowledge personal, or the family that slept warm in January while the world outside was trying to become impossible. It simply blows, north to south, the way it always has. And somewhere in the county, in the space where the Crescent Wall once stood, there is an absence of stone that is shaped exactly like the thing that used to protect the space behind it. That shape is what remains. That shape is enough.